Here we are once again, day 2 shooting in Positano. I'm actually standing just on our little balcony, and the reason I'm out here is from our, I guess it's a living room. There's these little porthole windows, and we've been looking out this window, and the view is really cool. It's actually completely opposite to the view we shot before. The view we shot before was the main classic view of the town, and we're actually staying on the other side. So when we look out our apartment window, we're seeing the other side of the town. We can actually see the spot that we shot last night. So I started thinking, maybe we can get 2 shots that represent Positano. Maybe if we shoot it from the other side, it'll look so completely different that I'll be able to use 2 shots to represent the same place. Most of the time we're looking for one very big iconic shot, but sometimes there's multiple angles that look pretty good too. So walking out here and just looking out on our balcony, which would obviously be the easiest solution for shooting, it's nice. It has a lot of potential, but unlike our porthole window view, which was unobstructed by barricades or anything for that matter, I have this, well, the part of our apartment here right on the side that obstructs that part of the view. I have a clothesline. I have a netting that's covering the citrus trees for the season, and there's just a bunch of stuff in the way. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk around a little bit. If our window has that view and people have it on their balcony, there's bound to be some places in the town that have a similar view we can shoot. Now bear in mind we're in an old Italian village, so everything's kind of linked with stone stairs. So we're going to go up to the top first. I'm going to take a look for some spots, see if I like anything, and I'm going to work my way down until I find something that I really like. Now in the past, I may have scouted with all of my gear or maybe a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, but now what I really like to do is go ultra simple and scout with just my iPhone. Now there's a couple reasons for this. One reason is we're going to climb up and down possibly hundreds if not thousands of stairs, so I really don't want to carry my backpack way up and down. The other reason is I'm not going to be shooting for another couple of hours, so I can scout during the day or when it's overcast like this, and I can get an idea of what I like and get reference shots just using my iPhone. Shooting with the iPhone may not produce portfolio quality work, but it gives you some key advantages. One, obviously, it's lightweight and easy to follow, and you can guess that your shots are right around 28 to 30 millimeter. And if you want to shoot wider, it's really easy to shoot a pano with the iPhone. You just turn it to pano mode, click a button, swipe to the side, and then you can see what a pano would look like without having to shoot and edit the pano for the result. If I get to the location and I feel like I need to zoom in, I can assume that on my camera I'm going to need something a little bit longer than 28 or 30 millimeters. If I want to zoom out, I'm going to need something wider than 28 or 30 millimeters. Or if I find myself wanting to do a pano and the pano looks great, I may think about bringing my pano gear along as well. So I'm going to pack up my camera gear just like this, grab my umbrella, and we're going to head up and see if we can find a good view. So here we are. This is about as high up as I want to go when we're scouting for this shot. To get here, we had to walk up quite a few stairs, and this whole town, all of these homes are linked by one long, windy road and a bunch of concrete stairs. It's not like we had to climb a mountain or anything, but we did have to climb quite a few stairs, so it makes me really happy with my decision to just bring my iPhone for scouting. The reason I'm fully confident with just bringing my iPhone to scout is I know these images are just going to be for my reference. Even if I would have brought one of my professional cameras up here, I know I wouldn't keep the shot for my portfolio. They would have been fine for personal archives or to show friends, or in this case for reference, but it's the middle of the afternoon, and my entire portfolio is built on using the blue hour or the sunset or the best lit times of day. Because it is overcast, you get completely even lighting. But since that lighting is even, it's also really flat. And in this case, that flatness kind of comes across as boring. Now you have to bear in mind that this might be your first time seeing this place, and it might be spectacular, and it is spectacular. But if you're going to show this to the world and you want it to be the best shot possible, you're going to want it in the best lighting, with the best environment possible. In that case, and in this case, I'm looking for the lights from the city to come on. So I know that the blue hour is going to look much more unique than a standard middle of the day shot, because most people who come here are just coming here on vacation, and if you search Google, what you're going to see is this vantage point shot in the middle of the day, probably on a phone or a camera. But what you're going to notice is you're going to see an image like that everywhere that you look. So what we're really trying to do here is identify first a great location, a great position to take a photo, and then what time of day to shoot it. So while everything may seem beautiful to you, you really have to keep in mind that somebody may have seen this town 100 times, and then they see your photo and they're like, wow, he did something completely different. I've never seen it with the lights coming on. I've never seen it with that kind of sky, or I've never seen it this particular way. So in order to create exceptional work or unique work, and it's what I try to do with my portfolio, I'm always trying to take it a little bit further and challenge people to see something in a different way. And that's why the Blue Hour works so well, and that's why I can spend the day or the afternoon with a sky and conditions that I normally wouldn't shoot in, spend the day shooting just on my iPhone, enjoying the views and figuring out where I'm going to shoot once the light turns perfect. Now that we're up here, I'm going to take a few shots with my iPhone. I might even take a pano, and then let's talk about what I like and I don't like about this position. Something to point out before I start taking photos is using this iPhone, I'm actually using the standard Apple photography app. I'm not using anything fancy. I just want to show you guys what you can do straight out of iPhone camera without any special features. So here we are. This is the basic view. This is straight out of camera. I'm actually recording video this so I can have you guys follow along with me as I take a look. So right now, I mean, it looks okay. There's nothing too spectacular about it, but what I love is that when I pan to the left, I get a lot of this town. So the town really opens up. I can see how far it goes into the mountain. But what I really don't like is if I pan to the right and I want to see that beautiful water, you can see that the tip of the mountain there is covered with those trees. Now those trees being there, that's enough for this to be a deal breaker on its own. But if I really wanted to get this shot, I'd want to shoot a little bit wider and crop it about there. But if I look down a little bit, you can see the tops of these buildings. These roofs are all in the way. And if I pan over here to the left, stone steps and a building. And over here you can see I may want to venture down, try to get on top of those roofs, but it says private right there. So I know that I shouldn't really go down there and find a better view. But even looking down there, I can tell it's not going to take me anywhere I want to be unless I actually get out on these people's roofs. And I'm going to advise you guys to not do that, or else you're going to end up with somebody very, very angry at you. So this spot, it's really nice. I'd recommend it if you want to bring somebody up here, have a glass of wine. But for photography, it's not going to get you more than just a snapshot. Let's say, for example, that these trees weren't obscuring my view. Would I stay up here and shoot, or would I look for a different location? Well, the answer is pretty simple. While a lot of photographers think that a higher vantage point is the best vantage point, and I've certainly referenced this in previous tutorials, sometimes the highest point isn't necessarily the best. So while this view really opens up the town, it also makes the dome of that church pretty much obscure. It's way down there on the frame, and the top of the town is way up here. That's very different from the view outside of the apartment, where we could very clearly see this church and the mountain itself. Now, if this was the only view I had and I was stuck shooting just this view, didn't have the opportunity to go back down to our balcony or somewhere else in this town, I guess this would be a good spot to maybe do some telephoto shots. Like the town right there in the center, I might be able to zoom in on that and isolate it, and there may be little detail things to pick up. But for an overall vantage point, it's just not going to work. All right, so we know this isn't going to be the spot. I really like the position a little bit further down, closer to our apartment, because it shows the church, it shows the town and the mountain. So even if these trees weren't in the way, I still really wouldn't like this shot for a portfolio shot. So I wouldn't even settle on it, even if it had an unobstructed view. And we're going to take a look at another view that I know. And I really want to point this out too. A lot of people ask me, how do you scout? How do you find these locations? And most of the time, it's like this. It's walking around. Very rarely do I know exactly where to go. I usually have to walk up and down the towns, figure out lookout windows, book hotels with views, do Google searches, use GPS coordinates. It's really a combination of everything. And honestly, this is the most fun thing that I have to do before I shoot, is actually explore the town and find these cool vantage points. And it's also nice, you do it very lightweight, just carrying a phone, stop for a coffee every once in a while, and it's a really nice day. And you can do it any time of day, whether it's raining, whether it's sunny, whether it's overcast. All you're doing is trying to compare different perspectives and figure out where you want to concentrate your time during the best times of light. Now that we know we're not going to use this shot, it's time to head further down and try to find a view that more closely matches what I saw from our balcony. Heading back down the stairs, I kind of took a different way down than I went up so I could maybe find something new, and I happened upon this other location and this different vantage point. This seems to be a pretty easy spot to get to, and even though you can see some things in the way, it's also pretty easy to set something up and shoot through these wires and clotheslines and antennas and things like that. But let's take a look at the view and see if it's any better than what we found before. So here we are, view that's slightly further down than we were before, and you might notice that the sun has actually come out, so it looks completely different. And you can kind of see what I was saying about the light. So before it was really flat, and now it's really harsh. And if I look down here to the left, you can see we have really harsh shadows. So I might want to say in this situation, the soft flat light was actually better because that shadow is pretty bad. During the blue hour, obviously that shadow is not going to exist, but let's take a look at the shot. Immediately, what I like much better than the last one is we can actually see the edge of the mountain into the water, and we have a lot of leading space. But if we take a look a little bit further down, here's the problem. And this is why this shot's a deal breaker. You can see the church way down there, still not feeling like it's part of the town and the mountain, and completely obscured by trees, buildings, satellite dishes, and a bunch of other stuff here on the left. So while this view is starting to look a little bit better and it's starting to have a shape, a compositional shape that frames the town and the mountain, it's just not there yet. We're going to have to explore a little bit more. So here we are. We've walked down even further. This is actually quite a bit lower than where our apartment was situated from that original vantage point that I wanted to try to simulate. And it looks really nice, actually. I'm going to take out my phone right now. Let's take a look, and I'll tell you what works about the composition. Here's the view right through my phone, and I want you guys to keep in mind that since it is video, it's shooting 16:9, which is a little bit wider, meaning that if you shoot through your camera in a standard 3:2 format, you're going to get a little bit more of the bottom and the top like that. But all things considered, even this by itself in 16:9 looks great. I mean, here we have that little church. It's just below the waterline, and we've compressed the mountain and the town together and still have the edge of the mountain over there. So it's created a really nice scene. If I pan over to the left, I still have a lot of beautiful buildings, and I can go even further, and eventually I'm just obstructed by this tree, which is way out of the frame that I'd use anyway. If I go up, you can see we have the top of the mountain, and we have this whole beautiful area to photograph. So I think this is going to work perfectly. This is also really nice because from this location a little bit further down, we are no longer looking down at the town. We are actually within the town. So if I pan over to the left, you can see that we're looking eye to eye with the windows of those buildings, and I still get the perspective of the height of the mountain, of the town itself, and I get this great vantage point as well. So this works really well, I'd say. One more thing to point out is I've just been talking about composition, but let's talk about lighting too. The lighting does not work right now because it's really harsh. When we were at the very top, the light was too flat. Then when we checked that next vantage point, it was getting too harsh and we had shadows. Same thing down here. The sky is cleared a little bit more. It looks actually nice. But here to the left, you see that harsh shadow line. That just doesn't work for photography. So what we need to do is wait a little bit longer. That shadow line is going to crawl. Everything's going to be engulfed in shadow as the sun goes down. Then when the sun goes down, we're going to enter the blue hour when it starts to get dark out, and we're going to get that illumination from within, and hopefully everything will look great. So now it's time to head back to the apartment, get all of the gear, which thankfully I didn't walk around with in these varying weather conditions, and get back down here and wait for the perfect light. After a whole day of scouting, we've arrived in my favorite location just in time for what I hope is going to be a beautiful blue hour. As you can see right now, beautiful pink light behind me. That sun has just dipped below the horizon, so it's shooting light back up in this direction and illuminating some of the clouds. Now those clouds actually aren't in my shot because I'm framing a little bit more tight, keeping the church as an emphasis in this frame. The setup and framing of this shot is actually quite simple, and it's not much different from what I shot last night. Key difference is you might notice I have my entire tripod up on this concrete slab, and I'm using the center column to give myself a little bit of height over this bougainvillea bush right here. Now, the main reason I'm doing that is because this is a very busy, very public road, and the cars on this narrow road are going both directions, so sometimes they have to sort of tip into this lane. Now, since I'm counting on maybe having to blend different elements together, obviously if I set my tripod up here and two cars came at an intersection and I needed to move, I'd have to move the tripod and it could blow my whole shot for the night. So what I've done is I've put it up here, kept it out of the way, so even if I need to jump out of the way and get out of the danger of the vehicles, it's not going to wreck my shot. This camera right here is already locked in on a fairly medium framed composition, and it's been shooting at an interval, 3 bracketed exposures every 1.5 minutes. But before I had this set up and ready to go, I took a few reference shots that I want to walk you guys through so you can see how I arrived at this composition. Let's start by taking a look at the shot that I chose. If you look here, the reason I like this composition and this focal length is because it gives emphasis to the church and showcases a lot of the town. And while it showcases a lot of the town, it also shows that beautiful sky and some of the water. I also made sure to not crop out that mountain that you see in the distance. So I framed the composition so I gave enough lead space on the right of that mountain so it's not cropped. The other thing that I've done is I've angled the composition slightly up so I'm giving more sky than I am water. Now at this point, it's personal preference whether you want to move the camera a little bit to the right, which is going to show more water, or a little bit to the left, if it's going to show more town. That's completely up to you. But check out what happens if I zoom out more. So this shot is pretty much zoomed all the way out on my camera. It's essentially somewhere between 15 and 16 millimeter when it's converted to a 35 millimeter crop. Immediately what you'll see is because it's a wide angle, we lose that emphasis on that beautiful little church down in the lower right corner. We also start to see the constraints or boundaries of the scene in which we're shooting in. You can see we have trees in a building on the right, and we have more stuff on the bottom of the frame and a tree on the left. It's good to point out, though, if I were to shoot wide like this, even though I have some problems on the bottom and on the right and the left, I could crop this into a wide-angle composition, framing a lot of the city and a little bit more of the water, so that could also work. Now, once again, let's take a look at the composition that I chose. Again, now we can really see how I chose this composition based on having the church fairly dominant on the lower right, enough of the town, enough of that beautiful sky, and the water itself. So I think this is going to work very well, and it's a nice balance of all of the options that we had to play with. This is day 2 of shooting in Positano, and what I really like about this shot is it's completely different than the shot I took before. The main reason is we're on the other side of the town. We're on the side of the town that I photographed before. So this is the complete opposite side. And unlike the previous shot where the sun was setting behind the mountain, now my sun's not in frame. It actually set behind me. So this is going to be easy to shoot at blue hour. It's going to be evenly lit, and that light is also going to fall off into darkness evenly as well. So I should be able to pick up a nice single exposure. Unfortunately, since the sunset was actually over here out of frame as we approached the blue hour, the sky is kind of turning a little bit too blue and too flat as the lights start to illuminate the city itself. Thankfully, this camera has been set up and shooting for about an hour, and before the sun went down, this side of the sky illuminated in beautiful hues, and even part of the mountain turned red because of the intensity of the sun. So what I'm hoping is that in post, I'll be able to use some of those frames and blend them together. Right now, we're approaching that perfect time during blue hour when everything is in harmony. The city lights look fantastic. The sky still looks great. I can still see the greens in the trees on the mountain. It's also getting dark enough where Lee and Patrick have turned on the panel light to illuminate me for this interview. So I know this is just about where I want to be for my final shot. This will be a little bit of a review from last night, but the settings for the camera are pretty much identical. I'm shooting in f8. I'm shooting 3 exposure brackets in aperture priority mode. And just to free up myself for this interview and to automate the camera because it's cold and I want to put my gloves on in my pockets, I've set it up into interval timer shooting. And I'm shooting this time because I'm not worried about capturing the sunset and all of those details like I was last night. I spread it out a little bit further to 1.5 minutes. Last night I was shooting at a 1 minute interval, but this time I'm safe with 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes. Remember, we're still warming up to this photography again in this series, so it's a good time for me to explain blue hour itself. Now, when I'm capturing blue hour, I'm really looking for a specific moment in time. Sometimes that's an early blue hour, which means there's still a little bit of light in the sky, and I can see a lot of detail in the background, the elements themselves, or it's a very late blue hour. A late blue hour means the sky is much darker, but I can see all of the lights from the town intensely. But usually, and most of the time when I'm shooting blue hour, it's capturing somewhere in between early and late. Let's take a look at an example of this shot captured during an early blue hour. In this shot, you can see that some of the lights have come on in the town. We can still see those details in the scene, and we have a lot of light left in the sky. Starting to turn a little bit blue, we can see some of the detail, but we know if it gets a little bit darker, those lights from the city are going to be even more intense. Now let's take a look at the middle blue hour. This is close to something I want as my final image. You can see more intensity from the town, but you can still see there's nice blue, yet a little bit darker color in the sky. This is starting to look really good. Now let's take a look at a late blue hour shot. This is about the boundary of when I shoot blue hour. Check out that really rich blue color in the sky. I really like that. But since it has gotten a little bit darker, the sky has improved a little bit in color, but we've also lost the detail in the trees and in the mountain. It's still there a little bit, but we've lost a lot of it. But on the plus side, we've gained more detail and illumination in the town. So this looks good as well. I think the perfect blend is going to be somewhere between a mid to a late blue hour. A question I get a lot is there a perfect shutter speed to capture blue hour? In other words, is there a time when my camera is going to expose for, let's say, 15 seconds, and that's going to signify that is the perfect blue hour? Unfortunately, the answer is yes, maybe no, and sometimes, because every scene is different. Here, for example, there's a lot of ambient light, so I can probably shoot through a lot darker of a situation. And remember, in the scene before, the background was so bright that it was really hard to tell. My foreground looked really dark. So even when it seemed full dark outside, it was a really long exposure. We had to get into a really dark blue hour to be able to get all of those details. Here, honestly, it could look nice anywhere from an early to late blue hour. The rule of thumb, though, is it's easier to tell when a blue hour is over because things start to turn black. We no longer see the green in the trees. We no longer see the details of the mountains. We start to lose the details of the clouds in the sky. That blue turns into a really deep blue and then eventually turns to black. Also, as a consequence of the lack of ambient light, the illumination from the town becomes too intense. So what you'll see is some of those light sources will start to wash out the details of everything around them. So you have to find that harmony, that visual balance. And the nice thing about leaving your camera set up and shooting through this isn't just the blending, it's that you can go through and figure out which one works for each scene. And oftentimes I'll think it's going to be a blue hour that's early. I may have thought the early blue hour was going to be perfect here. When I get into post-processing and I open those files on my computer or in Lightroom, I notice that when it got darker, I see more of the city. Or when it got even darker than that, I see even more of the city from within, and there are no distracting lights. So my advice is to shoot through the entire blue hour if you know you're going to want to use it. This image in particular, I think, is pretty nice. It's very unique. We have this cascade of buildings down this really steep mountain. It's very unique to the world. And here, the houses in the town engulf most of the frame, and we have very little water and sky compared to those buildings. But last night's shot, we had a lot of water because we were only able to shoot a tiny portion of the compressed town. So this is completely different. Even though I have a feeling, I think that I'm going to like the other shot I took from last night from the other perspective, it's going to be fun to put these two together, see them side by side, because they're so different. So even though I think that might be my favorite, I may like things about this one as well. We are approaching full darkness. It's the end of the blue hour, so I'm going to hurry up, grab a few more frames here before it gets totally dark. So if this is the latest I like to shoot blue hour, or at least close to as late as I like to shoot blue hour, what happens when you shoot too late at night? Take a look at this frame. This is what I consider to be nighttime photography or past blue hour. And what you'll notice is the frame almost seems like it's underexposed. You just have black chunks in the mountain, you see the hot lights of the town, and there's still a faint blue color in the sky, but it's almost gone. Overall, I think today was pretty fun. We had a chance to scout a lot of Positano and then settle on this beautiful composition here. I was able to cover some different techniques in blue hour. And what I'm most excited about is I thought this was just going to be a simple blue hour. And even if it is, it's a great one. But I think I'm going to be able to blend some of the earlier sky in when we had those colors. So sometimes I land on these locations and I think I know exactly what I'm going to get. And then sometimes Mother Nature surprises me. So this is going to be really fun. Now that everything's shot, it's fully dark outside. I'm getting blinded by this panel light. Cars are zipping by us and flashing us with their lights. It's time to pack this up, capture the images, and bring them in for post-processing. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. We are going to be working on the second lesson from Positano, and while the first lesson was complicated in theory, we actually went out with a bang on the first episode, and we did some time blending. We actually took a sunset, mixed the sunset with 2 stages of blue hour. We're going to take a few steps back now, and instead of blending a sunset with a blue hour, we're going to look for the perfect blue hour instead. So let's dive right in to Lightroom. Now, once again, I'm showing you guys my entire Lightroom catalog of images. And remember, I was shooting the interval timer, so look at all of those shots all the way to the end of the blue hour until full dark. Now, I want to point something out. If I go all the way back to the beginning here, and I've kind of highlighted an underexposed image here, you can see the sky. Now, this is a really beautiful sky. And that would give me the opportunity to say, you know what, I want to do another blend. I'd like to use part of the sky and the highlights on the mountains themselves and try to blend that with the blue hour. But what I learned as I went through the selection process, just like last time, highlighting every single one and going through them one by one, I actually kind of came up to this section. And you can see I've highlighted a few here. Let me go ahead and go through these, and I'm just going to go ahead and select them all. So the ones that I'm selecting, these are the regular or neutral exposure, so not overexposed or underexposed. And I'm just going to kind of go through these really quick. So I'm going to start with the beginning of the selection. Now you can see this one looks really nice. The lights are starting to turn on. And what I discovered was it would be a lot more work to blend the sunset sky in with the blue hour. And in my opinion, the sky from way back here, just before the mountain was done lighting up, this sky itself, it's nice, and you can see that there's some color in it, but honestly, the blue hour sky is just as beautiful. So sometimes you have to assess, if the sky didn't do something amazing or epic, is it worth taking the extra time to put it in there? And ultimately, that's going to be up to you. How do you want your image to look? How much blending do you want to put in there? But bear in mind, the more blending you do, the more chances you have for error if it doesn't end up seamless. So if we look at the blue hour here, you can see that it's looking pretty nice. We have some beautiful lights, and actually since the sun was setting behind us, instead of the last scene where it was setting behind the mountain and washing everything out, now it's actually casting some nice light. Even though it's post-sunset, you can see that we still have some nice ambient light here in the mountain. You remember the last one was really blown out and kind of dull and we had to do a lot of work. This is what it should look like. It should have all of these nice warm tones in it and nice shades of green. So as I go through the blue hour, what am I really looking for? It's one, I'm kind of looking at the cloud pattern here, and as I go over to these other ones, and I'm just going to use the arrow keys here, you can see that it dramatically starts to fall off and get darker pretty quick. Now the other thing that I'm noticing as I'm doing this are a few things. One, as I said, is the sky. And 2 is the water. Look how the water starts to change. From this one, this is the last one that I have selected in the sequence, to the first one. Now the first one, the water looks much cleaner. And the second one, the water looks even cleaner than that. Now that's because of the exposure time, but also because of the wind. Everything's changing from frame to frame. So that's the first thing that I'm looking at. I really like the sky in this shot and in this shot. And I really like the water in this particular shot, where if I go further in time, I don't like all this darker water. Now in Photoshop, could I clean it up? Of course I could, but I'd rather not because it saves time to actually use the one that I like. Plus, the difference from here to here is not very dramatic. And if I do that again from the left, you can see up here in the corner, just a little bit of light changes from there to there. Not a deal breaker for me, just a few lights. If I go further in time, here to the left, you can see that these lights disappear. And if I go back to the right, they reappear. So what I've actually settled on are these 3 exposures. Now the way that I went about that was selecting each one. I probably selected 30 or 40, and then I narrowed it down to 10 or 15, and then I narrowed it down even more. So what I do to narrow it down, and again, just like the last lesson, I like to use colors instead of flagging. What I did is I selected the range that I thought had potential and made it yellow. And then as soon as I decided on the final one, I actually made those files green. So later on, if I went back into this project and I thought, you know what, I want to select a different blue hour, I think this one had some issues, I'll know exactly what my thought process was and how I narrowed down that range. But since this is hundreds of files and there's no way that we could make a product that is a 12,000 billion terabyte download, I've actually prepared the project so we can look right at it. So if you go to project files themselves, can actually go here, Lesson 2, Lightroom Catalog, Lesson 2, Italy Positano, Blue Hour. Let's open up that Lightroom Catalog together. Here we are in the simplified classroom Lightroom Catalog. You can see that I've exported those, and the EXIF data came in, so they're still green. We can kind of see what's going on. If I actually select the first one here, this is the metered exposure from the camera, and honestly, it has a lot going for it already. And if I just roll through that, it'll be the overexposed next, and then the underexposed image. So let's go back to the metered exposure and let's take a look. Now, it looks pretty nice, but there are some issues. Obviously, we have to recover the shadows a little bit. If I hit the J key, you can see that very little is actually blown out here in the shadows on those blue little highlights there that's showing that. And also in the red, you can see that very little is technically blown out in those highlights. But let's go ahead and turn that off and let's examine this. Let's take a closer look at that. Let's zoom in on something like this. We'll go right in. We'll try to see if I can get down there. That was a little too close. We'll go back it up just a little bit. Let's try to look and see inside this person's home right here. And I think if I hit J there, it's barely touched white. But the thing is, even if I underexpose this, if I just pull this exposure down, there's only so far I can go to show the inside of that home. And it's not like I'm trying to look into people's homes, but I'd rather have all of these highlights intact. So that's a really interesting thing, because everything on the surface, while it looks like it's good, it has good integrity, certainly on the back of the LCD and in the histogram on your camera, you're going to think everything's fine. But I had to pull that down almost 2.5 stops in the highlights. And I'm not really doing anything but crushing these values down, turning those whites into gray. I'm not retaining or maintaining any of the detail that's actually there in the shot. So let's zero that out. Let's go to the underexposed shot instead, and we'll take a look. Now the underexposed shot, you can already, as soon as that loads, we can see there's a lot more going on here. And if I start to underexpose this one, for example, you can see that I'm actually retaining more of that detail. So now we can see the details on the wall. We can see that there's actually a corner here. It looks like they have, I don't even know what that is in the corner. I'm going to say potted plant, not scary Chucky doll. We're going to go with potted plant instead of that. But as you can see, these lights are actually starting to come back, and it was just about as much as I wanted to pull down. If we subtract an exposure, about 1.5 exposures down. So we'll go back to that in a minute. So we know, and we've done this extensively now, we know that we can always get more out of the shadows than we can the highlights. So let's go ahead and base things on that. What we're going to actually do is we're going to work on the neutral exposure, we're going to balance this, and then what we're going to do is we're going to use a little bit of luminosity masking to bring the underexposed image in and mask in just those super highlights so we can maintain the integrity of the entire image through the range of shadows and highlights. Now, before I move forward with the image adjustment itself, let's go ahead and remember I zero out these settings, so when you open these files, everything should be zeroed out. We definitely want to take advantage of the sharpening and the noise reduction. So the first thing I'll do is add the noise reduction, and I'm just going to add 20 noise reduction and hit enter. Now I could select this, copy the developed settings, paste them, but since it's only 3 files, I'm actually just going to manually tick this to 20. It actually takes about the same amount of time. We'll scroll all the way back up to the top here now that settings are good. We're going to go up here and we're going to bump the exposure a little bit and just make some simple adjustments. So let's bring the exposure up just a little bit, something around 0.6 or 0.65. And let's also pull the shadows up because I feel like this area here needs some shadow adjustment, just till we start to see those details. Now, I don't want to bring them back all the way. I basically just want them to to just start to be visible down here. I don't want there to be any blacks, and I do want to pick up some of this detail that we previously lost. While we're at it, we have all this beautiful color. I'm going to add just 10% vibrance just to bump that. And you can see if I go up all the way, it looks a little ridiculous, but a little bit here instead of a lot can go a long way. The next thing I want to do is I want to dress the lower part. So I feel like we still need some shadow adjustment in the bottom to bring out those trees and all of those dark objects, but I feel like the shadows up here in the top are perfect. So what I'm going to do is just take the gradient tool, and I'm going to draw a gradient from the bottom up just like this. That looks pretty good. Now it's just going to have some settings right off the bat. Let me just go ahead and zero those out. And what I'm going to do is pull the shadows up just a little bit more, just to bring up that detail. Maybe another 25 here, or 30, right around 25 or 30. And then I'm going to hit the J key just to see if anything's black. Nothing's really black or blown out, but I'm going to bring the blacks up just to balance it just a little bit. And you can see that the blacks will dramatically bring this. But if you go too high with the blacks, it's going to make it too gray. So I just want to balance a little bit. I like even numbers, even though 5 is an odd number. In post-processing, it's half of 10, so it's pretty even. So we'll make 25 and 5. That looks pretty good. Next thing I want to do is create a new mask for the sky itself. And I'm going to do that the same way, holding Shift, locking it down. And what I want to do is just go ahead and pull that mask down just a little bit. Now here, as I brought the exposure up on the scene, now it's time to compensate by pulling the highlights down just a little bit. Do this selectively. That looks pretty good. Now I was already going to bring the shadows up a little bit, so I can leave that the same way here, just like it was. Turn the blacks off, because remember it kept the settings from before. So pull the highlights down until we're satisfied. Now the other thing I'm going to do, just to add a little bit of detail here, is some dehaze. And dehaze works really well for skies. It allows you to create some really nice deep contrast in that sky. Now if you go too far with this, which you don't want to do, you can always do more in Photoshop. The way you compensate for it, if the clouds are starting to get a little too dark, is by raising the shadows. And if that doesn't work, you can actually raise the blacks a little bit. And that'll actually pull those values up. So you get all of the contrast, and you still maintain all of the balance of the shadows. If you go too far in the dehaze, it just tends to crush all the values down a little bit. So let's do that. Let's pull the shadows down just a little bit more. That looks pretty good. And I'll just go ahead and click this to go back to the global settings. Back in these settings, this is where I can make those final tweaks. You know what? I might want to pull the highlights down just a little bit. Just a hair. Now, before I move on though, I want to address something. I want to figure out if this is actually level or not. It looks a little bit off to me, but if it is off, it's off just a little bit. Now remember, in the field, I'm using my built-in camera level, which is accurate to a percentage. Every camera is going to be a little bit different. I think Fujifilm is about 5%. So once you get on that green line and it says everything's level, you notice how you can kind of wobble the camera and it's still level, and you're not sure if it's actually level. This could be that small discrepancy. And let's go ahead and take a look. And the way I like to do that is just zoom in and pan this up to a hard edge, basically, which is the screen. And if I move that around, we can kind of see that, you know what? It's off a little bit. See how, if I actually put that right up to the top there, you see how this actually gets a little bit thicker here and then thinner? I can tell that this needs to be rotated a tiny little bit. So I'm going to do that too. I'm going to do that here inside of Lightroom before I go into Photoshop. And let's go ahead and do that together all the way down here under Transform. Now I could tell it to do it automatically, but I don't really think it's going to do a great job, to be honest. Let's go ahead and see if it'll do level. It didn't do anything, so it didn't do a very good job in my opinion. Let's go ahead and rotate it ourselves. So I know that this is a tiny, tiny percentage, so I'm actually going to just do 0.1 rotation here, and I'm going to hit enter. All right, now we can see that's actually corrected that. So it's very, very close to level, if not perfect. If I go to the next one here, I'm just going to do the same thing. So 0.1. Now, even though I'm not using this exposure, I may use this exposure, so I'm going to want it to be the same. Last one. Perfect. All right, that all looks pretty good. Okay, so next step, we have this one completely edited. We know exactly what we want. Let's go ahead and set our export settings again. Now, I've been working on some other things, so I need to make sure that it's ready to go. Let's go ahead and say export. And just like I thought, I was working on some other lessons. I'm going to go back to my temp folder, choose that temp folder. I'm going to go to PSD, ProPhoto, 16-bit. Do not change the size, nothing else. And after it's done, I'm going to ask it to open it in Photoshop CC 2017. And I'm going to click Export. Here's our file in Photoshop. Now, before I go any further, this is looking pretty good. This is the perfect base plate. The next thing I want to do is go ahead and fix what I call these super highlights down here. So we're going to go back to Lightroom here. And inside of Lightroom, now we're going to address the underexposed file. Now, this is drastically different between this file and this file. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to balance them. We're going to try to get them to be pretty close. Now, while I want the highlights to really be the key here, we're really only going to put the highlights over top of that image in Photoshop. I want these to be as close as possible so that the surrounding pixels around the highlights, if there's any overlap, that they look as close as possible and there are no seams or darker, lighter edges. So the first thing I'm going to do is make some adjustments. First thing is this needs to be exposed much more. Let's actually expose it 1.5. So it's getting closer to the other exposure. And you know what? Let's crank those highlights all the way down. Let's pull those whites down too before they turn gray. And you can see now I'm starting to see inside that house again. Let's go ahead and pull the shadows up to compensate, just like that. Now, you can kind of see this is looking a little ridiculous. And you can see how just washed out and boring this looks compared to the neutral exposure. You can see how this one, as it loads in, looks much more sharp. The details are more crisp, where this is starting to look like a muted sort of HDR image. Now, saying that, you could still bring this back, add contrast, and give it that vitality and vibrance that it needs. But what I'm going to do is just use these highlights. And we'll just go back and forth again. If we take a look here, you can see how those are blown out. Everything else looks great. Here, everything else just looks kind of muted, but those highlights look amazing. So let's just go ahead and make some final adjustments here. And I'm going to export this the same way since everything was intact. Export with previous. Since I've worked on this before, I'll go ahead and use unique names. Here's our file in Photoshop. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring that into the other PSD, the same way I always do. Command A for select all. I'm going to copy it. Do it a couple times just in case. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it right on top. We'll just go ahead and close that out. Immediately as I do that, I'm also going to hit save just in case, because let's admit it, Photoshop never crashes, right? So now we have two layers, and we have our base layer, which looks really good, and then we have our highlights layer that looks, well, okay, but the highlights look really good. So what we're going to do, instead of just adding a mask and blending in little portions, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to create a channel mask. So just like the last lesson when we used a specific channel, this time we're going to use the luminosity of the entire image to select those super highlights. Now it's very easy. Again, if you guys have already been through Photographing the World 1 and 2, this is going to be a sort of a review for you guys. But if you're new to luminosity masking, or channel masking is what I like to call it, and it's what we called it since years of working in Photoshop, it's pretty simple. Just like the red, green, and blue channels can be isolated and used as selections, so can the RGB. And the RGB right now is just going to be a composite of all the channels, and it's going to show us the color. But if I command click the RGB and click on the Create New Mask button, just like the last lesson, I'm able to create a new alpha channel. And you can see that now it's just a selection of the highlights. Now, why is it just a selection of the highlights? Well, remember, in a selection, in a mask, in a gradient on a mask, any mask in Photoshop, anything that's white is going to be visible. Anything that's black is going to be invisible. So right now, those shadows in the mountains would not be visible. The shadows down here in the trees, not visible. But these highlights would be visible. So right now we have a highlight selection, albeit a very global one. If, for example, I was to invert this you can see now I'm actually knocking out the highlights. So the highlights would be removed from this selection and I would have created a shadow mask. Let me go ahead and invert that back. We'll name this highlights. So that's going to be highlights channel. What I'm going to do is go ahead and duplicate this channel because I feel right now it's a little bit too broad. And we'll come back to that in just a second. Let's go ahead and load it and see what's going to happen. So I'm going to command click it, go to layers, and now I'm going to turn this back on, this layer. But what I actually want to do is create a folder. I'm going to create a folder, put that mask, and we'll just call that group 1 for now. I'm not going to rename it. We'll put that mask on the folder and drag the highlights into that folder. We can take a look at what happens. So if I turn this off, you can see that, yes, it's filling those highlights. See how it's fixing and correcting these highlights down here? It looks really good. Let me go ahead and zoom in on this a little bit. Looks great, but you can see it's also affecting the surrounding pixels. So you see this building, it's adding a little bit of that just on the areas that aren't exactly the highlights anymore, the areas that I don't want to adjust. So all this clean color, all of this integrity that I left in this image by adjusting the neutral exposure is now being not harmed, but changed by this exposure. I don't want that to happen. So let's go ahead and go back to channels and take a look at the highlights. So I have the highlights here. We've identified what those do. Now let's take this and change it. We have highlights copy. Let's call this clamped highlights. And the reason I call this clamped highlights is I'm actually going to do what's called channel clamping. And I'm going to do that by selecting this new layer and doing Command M for curves. Now that's also under Image Adjust Curves. So if you're not sure of a hotkey, everything's also in the menu, Command M. And what I'm actually going to do is lock this down. So I want to maintain those highlights, but if I start to clamp this by just taking the black source and moving it here, you can see that that's going to start clamping those values around. Just like that. And if I do that in the other way, if I just pull this up a little bit, you can see that I'm going to increase the highlight range. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that alone, but I'm just going to go ahead and clamp this down. And what I'm really looking at is those really intense areas around. You see those really intense areas here. That looks pretty good. And we'll go ahead and clamp it the other way, just a hair, just to give it a little bit more punch in those highlights. That looks pretty good. So we have clamped highlights. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to command click this layer instead. We're going to turn that back on. Go back here, just throw this old mask away, add a new mask, and rename this clamped highlights. Perfect. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and rename this adjusted raw. This is adjusted highlights. Go ahead and turn that back on. All right, now if I turn this on and off, you can see that it's affecting a great deal less of the surrounding pixels. But I'm going to take it a step further. I'm going to basically seek out and destroy these highlights. And by destroy, I mean repair. So we're going to seek out and repair these highlights. So what I'm going to do is with this enabled, I actually have this mask on the folder. This layer is completely clean. I can put another mask on it. I'm going to go ahead and click Create a New Mask. I'm going to invert that mask so it's black, so I don't have anything. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here, pan over just a hair, and load up the brush tool. Now with the brush tool selected, I'm actually going to set a fill to about 20%, and I'm basically just going to start brushing these highlights in, so repairing them as needed. You can see as I do that, it starts to repair these highlights. Really simple. So if I turn this on and off, you can see those highlights are repaired. Now again, any of the surrounding pixels here, since I've clamped that channel and I've adjusted the source from Lightroom so that the surrounding pixels are not that much different from the pixels themselves, any overlap that I have with this paintbrush is just going to softly add that layer on top. So it's not going to be detrimental to anything around it. It gives us a lot of power. Like this light here, for example, we can really start to pull it down a little bit. And this one was really dramatic. We can see that if we turn this on and off. You can see that those blown out highlights now transform into something a lot more manageable. So again, as I zoom in and pan around this image, you can see I'm just going to start painting in these highlights, so fixing these highlights. Now, again, this is something that is a little bit time-consuming, but that time-consuming element to your work is what helps your work stand apart. So it's always a bummer when you upload something to a client and they're like, wow, those highlights are really blown out. And you're like, yeah, I guess I could have fixed that. Then again, you also don't want to go too far, like that old-fashioned HDR look where everything just looks muted. Obviously, bright areas are bright areas, dark areas are dark areas, but we want to find a balance. Like this here, for example, where I'm just painting this in, just having a little bit less intensity in those highlights makes a big difference. Well, let's go ahead and go out here. Not a huge fan of that green lighting. I don't know what they were thinking. It's a beautiful little town, but sometimes the lighting's a little funny. All right, so we're almost done here, just sort of wrapping it up. We'll definitely back it up a little bit here and do these larger adjustments on the church itself. Soften those highlights up all the way through here, all the way through here. And whatever that is way in the background needs to come down just a hair. And that's looking pretty good. I may have missed a few. It's usually what happens. But I think you guys get the idea of exactly how to do this. So again, if we turn this on and off, it's not going to be a dramatic difference, but it's definitely going to be a difference for these highlights. Now if I option click on this mask, we can actually see it here as it redraws. You'll see that it wasn't the majority of the frame, but in my opinion, those highlights were enough to warrant the adjustment. I just want to point out one thing very quickly about the channels. As we progress through Photographing the World 3, and just like we progressed through Photographing the World 1, and especially number 2, where we started blending moments in time, I relied heavily on channel masking and luminosity masking. And we did everything manually together. We created every mask together and everything that we needed in order to create these complicated blends and different things like that. What I want to point out is there are a lot of panels, there are a lot of plugins and presets, there are a bunch of different ways to do this, and I'm going to cover those different ways of doing things, but what I don't want to use is a panel. I feel like as we're going through this education and as I'm teaching you guys these techniques, I want you to feel comfortable building everything yourself before you start relying on plugins or panels to take the place of the manual labor involved. The reason being is by doing this yourself and continuously doing it from project to project or image to image, you build this into fundamental knowledge so you can solve it yourself. So what happens if you have a panel that does luminosity masking for you and somehow they update Photoshop and it doesn't work? What are you going to do when you can't go under the hood and make these masks yourself? So for the first few lessons especially, we're going to be building up in complexity, but as we go, we're going to be doing more and more channel masking and luminosity blending, masking all manually. So I just want to point that out. Next step, my favorite, object removal and cleanup. So let's take a look at this. The easiest thing though is we're just going to go ahead and create a layer first, put it right on top of the stack. I'm going to save it in the background. I'm going to name this cleanup. Cleanup and removal. How about that? Because I'm optimistic I'm going to find some things that I want to remove. So the first thing I want to do is zoom in on the water and the sky and see if there's anything detrimental that I want to remove. And that's going to be dust spots on the sensor, that's going to be birds, or that's going to be Lee flying the Mavic, anything that's going to be in the way of completing this scene. So let's go ahead and zoom in a few steps. And let's pan around here. Let's pan around. Oh, there's something there. I don't know what that is. Probably a bird. Let's go up to the healing brush, smaller healing brush with content aware. Just give that a little click there, and just like that, it's gone. Some other things here, that is probably a buoy or a seagull. I'm not sure. There's a lot of little things here, like just little things. And I feel like removing these things in the beginning is much easier than having to do it later when you start adding masks and sharpening layers and noise reduction, once we start going through those phases. Now, it's kind of like Murphy's Law that says anything that can go wrong will go wrong. That's kind of this, like I thought I got the highlights right, but of course I'm going to realize that I missed one. It's just like this, all these little seek and destroy things. Like you'll think you got everything in the sky, every little spot, every seagull, every streak, and then as soon as you send this to print or upload it to the client, they'll say, what is that? And of course, it's going to be that tiny thing you didn't notice. So the skies and everything, if we soften it, that might have disappeared, but I just try to zap it out in the beginning. Now the other thing that I want to address, if I go all the way down to the bottom of this image, are a few distracting elements. I'll go ahead and minimize that zoom so that we can actually see a little bit more. Now the first thing is, well, let's zoom it out a little bit more and take a look. I feel like this, whatever this is, this wall of this area, which looks like it sort of has an orange grow, I feel like that's very, very distracting. If I move over here, now obviously we're going to have to crop or scale this to get rid of that edge that we got. There are little things here that I find very distracting, like this roof right here. Now those things are easy to repair, and I can do that, like for example, in this area here, down here is easy. If I go to the clone stamp here, and that's S on the keyboard, and I'm going to use a very low flow, 10%. If I just grab, let's say, these trees right here, move it down here, we'll zoom in a little bit, I can actually just paint this here. Very easy. Just quickly paint that out. And I'm basically painting a tree line with matching tones into another tree line. Really simple stuff. Same thing here. What I can do is, with a smaller brush, I can go ahead and take some of this here, like this area, and move it down. And I'm actually going to crank that up to about 30% because I know I want to grab more than that. That looks pretty good. Now that I have that, I'm just going to reset, Alt-click, and just clean that up just a little bit. And for good measure, I'll go ahead and do the same thing here, as if that terminates into the trees. Very, very simple stuff. Same thing here. We'll just go ahead and remove a little bit of that. Now, again, very time consuming, but in my opinion, also very important. For this part here, I'm just going to blend it in by grabbing this element, using a 10% flow, and we're just going to softly blend that into the pavement, just like that. Now the rule is, if nobody knew it was there, they're not going to know it was gone either. It's in the lower quadrant of the image, so it's not very distracting overall. But it's time to really look for other elements here. Now, this is where you really need to look. In my opinion, this car does not look good right there. In fact, I don't like driving on the Amalfi Coast. Nobody likes driving on the Amalfi Coast. I had to drive on the Amalfi Coast because, conveniently, Patrick didn't know how to drive a stick shift, and at this point in the trip, Lee was terrified to try to drive on the Amalfi Coast. So nothing is going to give me a greater pleasure than removing an automobile from the Amalfi Coast. So we're going to do that. So we have clean up and object removal. Let's go ahead and get rid of this car. So this is going to be a little bit more complicated than the trees, but it's actually going to be pretty easy. So the first thing is I need to create a mask to maintain the integrity of this edge. I don't want to damage that roof. Now everything else, like if I was getting rid of this, for example, I could take some of this, put it there, some of this, put it there, and it's a blobby sort of element, but this is a very sharp element. So we have this layer. Let's go ahead and add a new one called car removal. And I'm going to go ahead and create a mask, and that's L for the lasso tool, and I'm just going to go ahead and grab the edge of this. I'm going to hold Option to turn it into the straight line tool. And just like this, I'm just going to make a selection around the area that I'm going to work. So we're going to go ahead and select that roof. Really simple. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a mask. So now anything that I do inside of here is not going to affect anything outside of that mask, which is going to make this a little bit easier. So let's go back to the clone stamp. I'll go ahead and pick 20% flow here. That should work pretty well. And the first thing that I'm going to do is just go ahead and start drawing some of this. Now this is infinite detail, and by infinite detail I mean it's repeatable. So this is stone wall. It's really far away. So basically whatever I do, while I take out the car here, I can also go ahead and take out these signs. I might as well go ahead and take out the billboard advertising anyway. In fact, this one I think is for a grocery store. So nothing says vacation paradise destination like super grocery store billboard on the wall. Here, very easy. Again, with clone stamping, and this isn't going to be the last time we're going to use any clone stamping, something like this is an edge that you can follow. So I can just grab an edge here, click, and move it up, and you can see that I can basically just move and continue that edge very easily. This detail right on that wall, I can move all the way down to the car itself, just like this. All the way down to the wall on the edge of the building because I've already created a mask. Really easy stuff. So here, I'm just going to go ahead and keep creating this, clean that up. The car had some lights on it. I'm going to go ahead and clean this up too, get rid of that sign, maybe add a little bit of detail back in there. Now we're just going to go ahead and fix this car, get rid of it altogether. Goodbye, little SUV in Positano. All right, so this is the easy part. Why is that the easy part? Well, that's repeatable detail. Next thing is the street itself. And again, I'm being a little bit obsessive here because this is so far away, but I want to get it as perfect as possible. I'm going to make this brush smaller. I'm going to option click right here between the road and the wall, and then I'm going to do the same thing here. And I'm actually going to start painting that out so that I just want that line right there. That's what I'm trying to create. And I can't go too far or else I'll get that light, so I have to be really careful. Now what I can do is grab this area, same thing right about here, and I can move down and paint the rest. Now again, this is all repeatable detail, makes it pretty easy, but you have to do small little steps to get it just right. So here we're going to have to continue it. Continue that road. Recreate it. And then as I recreate this road, I can go ahead and just recreate this road all the way to the house, just like that. Now it's a rocky path, so we can just go ahead and tweak it a little bit. And now I'm going to grab this here, this edge, and I'm going to clean this up a little bit because I want to be able to grab this part and remove that car entirely. Now it's important, what I'm actually doing, you see that arrow, crosshairs following, every time I let go, it actually resets it. So it's resetting it so it's actually like a new selection of that gray area so that I can just pull this in. And the same thing here, the fence. Pretty easy. And then again here, clean that up, grab part of the fence, fix it. Pretty easy. Same thing here. Fence goes all the way into the detail. Let's zoom it out just a hair and take a look at the before and after. Not bad at all. I'm going to go ahead and zoom it back to full screen. The next thing I want to do is I want to address the cause of the rotation. After we rotated this image, we have some pixels that need to either be cropped out or expanded. Now, it's really important that you know that as soon as you start manipulating the scale, the crop, or anything else inside of the PSD, if you try to bring another layer for blending in from Lightroom, it's not going to match up anymore. So that's why if you're doing a blend, a complicated thing, you might want to wait to do this till the end just in case there's something else that you want to bring in. In this case, there's nothing else that we need from Lightroom except the original file because I want to show a big before and after at the end. So what I'm actually going to do is reset this. And when I reset that, it's actually going to reset the rotation as well. So I'm going to go back down and I'm going to make sure that rotation is also set to, what was it again? That's right. So off that it was 0.1. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate that again and re-export this with previous. Use unique names. Now it's in Photoshop. Select all, copy, close, paste. Bring this down to the bottom. Call this Original Raw. Zoom out just a step. That looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take all of these layers and I'm going to drag them to a folder and I'm going to call this Blended Result. That looks pretty good. Now, with this blended result selected, this entire folder, instead of cropping, what I'm actually going to do is scale. So instead of cropping 1 pixel, I'm actually going to scale 1%. So Command T. And 100 is going to be 101. Conformed. And I'll hit Enter. Looks good. Save for good measure and move on to the next step. So the next step is to create some more contrast. I always like to marry the blends together, so we're going to go back into the Adobe Camera Raw filter and make some additional adjustments. In order to do that, I need to make a new layer based on everything that's in this folder. So now I can do that a few different ways. I can either drag it down here and use Command E like I did last time, which worked really well. Or I can use a really cool hotkey that basically just makes a copy of everything that's actively visible in your layer palette, and that's Shift, Option, Command, E. Well, it's a bit of gymnastics for your finger, but it gives you the same exact result. So now with that selected, let's go Filter, Camera, Raw Filter. Scale this up a little bit. I feel like that didn't come in the right size. Here, globally, I only want to do a few things. So I'm just going to pull the shadows up just a little bit, maybe 10%. And I'm going to add just a little tiny bit of contrast. And you can see if I go too far, we're really going to start to see that contrast take hold. But sometimes when we're adjusting things inside of Lightroom, we tend to pull the shadows up a little bit, pull the highlights down, and what that does is while it balances the scene, it also decreases the contrast. So I just want to pull a little bit of that back in. But what I really want to do is create a gradient for this lower part of the image while not affecting the rest of it. So I'm going to do that just by dragging the gradient tool up here, holding Shift, and locking it down. Now remembered everything that I did last time, so I'm going to go up here and reset local settings. Now I feel like in the last lesson, we had to add green to the trees, and I did that using a photo filter. But here you can see it's already really beautiful. We're going to do a little bit of that, but I can quickly change. Like these greens, I feel like they need to be warmer. It just feels kind of dull and flat, where this feels very alive and vibrant. So what I'm actually going to do is warm this up a little bit. Let's just put 20% here. And I'm actually going to offset. So we're going to warm up the bottom of the image and offset it a little bit, like -20. Just like that. We're also going to add just a little bit of contrast just to tie it back in. I feel like I went a little too crazy with the shadows when I was in Lightroom. So this is going to give me the ability to kind of bring that in, make it contrasty, and change the color. And I think that's all I really want to do. I can go back and just double check if there was anything else I wanted to do, adding a little bit more vibrance, maybe some dehaze or some contrast overall. We could do it now. But I think it looks pretty good. I'm going to click OK. With that result, I'm going to call this ACRF for Adobe Camera Raw Filter, and if I turn that off and on, you can now see how cool that image actually was. Next thing I want to get into is some selective adjustments using adjustment layers. But before that, let's go ahead and get the high pass filter out of the way. I want to do some micro sharpening here. So I'm going to duplicate this layer, go up to Filter, Other, High Pass Filter. Just like previously, 24 megapixels, pretty good at 2.5. We go ahead and apply that, and I'm going to use the light, no, not the lighten, sorry. I'm going to use the soft light blending mode. Let's zoom in a little bit. That looks good. We'll toggle it. It's on. We'll go ahead and turn it off, and you can see that we get a nice bit of extra bump on those buildings here, especially in this area. But I'm going to tone it down a little bit. I don't want it to be that intense. Maybe 2/3 that intense, just so we get a little bit. 68, 70%, 75, anything around there should be fine. I'm going to call this high pass 2.5. So we know later if we need to increase it, we can go back and we know exactly what we had. So I'm going to create a mask for this so we can selectively paint this in. I'm going to hold the Option key, click on the mask button so that I get a black mask instead of a white one. Press B for brush, change the brush size a little bit. With a flow of about 20%, I'm going to back this out a little bit. I'm just going to paint in the areas that I know I want, which are these areas here. All this rich detail in the city itself. As I paint the mask, if I hit the / key, I'll go back into Ruby Lift mode, and you can see that I can sort of hone in on this. Now, I don't want it on the mountains in the background, and the infinite detail. I don't want to sharpen those up, but I do want to sharpen everything in frame. Now, the idea here is this is the main bulk of the town and also the bulk of the composition. Don't like the details down here, it's just trees, but here it looks pretty nice. I don't want to get any of the water, any of the sky, but definitely this. We're almost like painting a compositional leading line using sharpness on the image. And that should work out pretty well. Again, we can change it anytime we want, simply by painting and changing it, manipulating it. All right, so high pass is out of the way. Now the next thing I want to address is something very important. When we have the blue hour, we actually get a lot of reflection from white. So white actually reflects that blue color. It happens in rooftops, especially in windows and everything. And to an extent, that's not necessarily a bad thing because it's very realistic. But in this case, it can become very distracting. Like I feel like that building right there should not be blue. It should be pretty much white or actually warm. So this is going to be pretty fun. I'm actually going to create sort of a color correction cocktail. And I'm going to do that first by addressing the shade itself. So the first thing is we're going to create an adjustment layer, a hue saturation layer. When those options come up, what I'm going to do is isolate just the blues. Now I'm going to stretch it into the cyans a little bit because this is actually blue and cyan. And if I change this here, like if I pull the lightness all the way down, you can see that that's removing the blues, obviously because the sky's disappearing too. If I move it up though, you can see that it's brightening those objects. Now I have to decide if I want to darken those objects a little bit or brighten them. In this case, I feel like I want to brighten them just a little bit, and I'm going to pull the saturation down just a hair. Now what I'm really looking at is this building, this area, and my target is to figure out the maximum I'd want to remove from that. If I turn this on and off, you can look at that. Blue to white, is that too much or too little? And you have to decide that by balancing these two factors just here. If you're not selecting it, you have to adjust this. Just clamping it down or expanding it will actually give you a greater range of selection in that color channel. Now the rules of RGB are very interesting. When I remove color, I like to put it back. It's a balance. If you add red, green, and blue together, you get white. So I'm removing a channel here and making this sort of dull object white. But honestly, this should have color and vibrancy in it. So what I'm going to do is actually add warmth back into it. So I'm going to go ahead and add a photo filter. And I'm going to select even the basic warming filter. If I go to any of these warming filters, you can see this color here. See the color of that building? Let me turn these both on and off. That's before. That's just with the hue saturation. That's with the photo filter applied. So you can see now it's coming back to life. I can even back this up to about 20%. So it gives it a little bit more life, some vibrancy, some color. Rather than just stripping all that color out, we're actually putting some back. Now what I'm actually going to do is something pretty clever. On this hue saturation layer, that's where I'm going to mask in the areas that I want to select. So what I'm actually going to do is link this layer to hue saturation, and I'm going to go ahead and black out this mask. So now this hue saturation becomes the control layer for the photo filter, and if I go ahead and expand, we'll put that away, we'll zoom in a little bit, select the brush tool with a flow of about 20% with the hue saturation layer. If I go ahead and paint these areas, you can see that now that blue is going to be removed, and inside of that mask also exists my photo filter, just like that. So it's a really nice effect. So we can go in here, and actually I'm just going to bring this up to 50%, and I'm going to zoom out because I know the exact areas that I need to do this. We're just going to go ahead and remove this color cast, this blue color cast down here, all the way down here, and we're just going to warm all this up, just like that. Pretty easy. And actually this is nice because it's also going to give it a little bit of vibrancy as well. Last thing you want is for everything to look desaturated. Perfect. This area looks good. And then I'm going to change the opacity, bring it down. There's some areas where I just want a little tiny bit, like this is actually a blue object. I want to leave that alone. But in this area, those shadows, I'm going to bring those out. This here, that blue light, again, not a fan of those blue Christmas lights. Let's go ahead and bring that down. Obviously, this roof right here. I think the worst of it was right here on the bottom, but there are a few things here just on the top that we can go ahead and adjust and identify as well. Let's clean that up. Exactly just like that. Let's take a look at this. Let's go ahead and name this too. This is going to go ahead and be blue reduction and photo filter. So we just call this warming filter. So the next thing I want to do is go back into the channels and create a shadow channel for a custom luminosity adjustment. Now that's pretty simple. If we go back into the channels, we already have our highlights selected. So here's our highlights. All we actually had to do, and you know what? I'm going to go ahead and keep all these channels for you guys here. I'll go ahead and duplicate this layer, and I'm going to call it shadows. And with a Command I, I'm going to invert it. And now I have a shadow channel. With the shadow channel selected, I'm going to go ahead and Command click it to load it as a selection. Select RGB so we can see everything. I'm going to create a new folder here. Create a mask. It'll apply it. I'll call this shadows. I'll put the high pass on top of everything. Now inside of the shadows, what I actually want to do is first take a look at the shadows here. Now I feel like I just want to affect the super shadows or the really dark elements. I feel like that needs to be brought up, but I don't really want to affect too much of the highlights. And you can see while I have the super highlights, the doors, those windows, all those things we brought back and worked very hard to maintain the clarity and quality, I also want to maintain the sky. So what I'm actually going to do is clamp this a little bit. I'm going to do that using curves. And remember, that's Image, Adjust, Curves, or Command M. And we're just going to go ahead and clamp this down the same way. If I do it this way, you can see that more of my highlights are going to be clamped out. That looks pretty good. I'm going to change this from shadows to clamped shadows. And with clamped shadows selected, I'm going to go ahead and add a curves layer. And I'm going to make sure that's inside of the clamped shadows, and that's curves. So with curves selected now, when I make adjustments to this, I'm actually adjusting everything except for the highlights. So I'm just going to do a pretty ridiculous adjustment. And if I shift click this mask, you can see that it'll show the results of it disabled. So that red X right there means that this mask is temporarily disabled. I'm going to click it again and it's going to come back. So you can see without that mask, you can see that I'm affecting the highlights. With that mask, I am only affecting the shadows. So it's getting a little dull here, but we're going to do something a little bit more custom. Let's go back to the settings and trash this a little bit. Just to review, on the curves itself, this represents the entire histogram of shadows, midtones, highlights. Each one of these lines here, these are quarter tones, 25%, 50%, 75%. If I obviously bring it up here, that's going to bring it in the lower quadrant of the shadows. But if I do that, I can immediately bring it down here, and not affect the higher shadows here. So what I can actually do is clamp down an area that I want to adjust. And I can do that just by moving these little points and adding some more. So you can see I can add some super contrast in here. And you can see before and after, if I get this just right, you can see that this line, this custom line that I've created, gives us really sharp, dramatic contrast. And it's doing that because it's only adding contrast in the areas of the luminosity that I am designating. In other words, right here around this adjusted midtone, just like this. I can go ahead and bring this down just a little bit, just like that. And I can create some really nice contrast there. And also brighten up that part of the image. Perfect. Just like that. So we can bring up those highlights and bring up those shadows around those highlights just so it gives it a little bit more kick. And we can also bring this area down just a hair. And there we go. So it was a little dull before, now it's starting to pop out with some detail. So that's kind of like a super contrast just in the shadows. We'll go ahead and close that up. Next thing I want to do is just warm up a few things. We're going to do that the same way we did last time. Really quickly, I'm going to grab another photo filter, and this time it's going to be a warming filter. So we're just going to use, I like 85 or 81. 81 seems to be a little bit more saturated, has a little bit more punch. We're going to call this warming filter. And I'm going to invert that mask by clicking on it, Command I for invert. Go here with the brush tool with a 10% flow, and I'm just going to go ahead and warm up some of the mountain here again, warm up some of these trees, especially warm up some of the stuff down here. I feel like that needs a little bit of work. So let's warm that up. Again, if you hit the backslash key, you can kind of see what you're doing, and you can see how you're just adding little bits here. I like to work without it. I find it fairly distracting sometimes. Let's go ahead and just paint this in. Perfect. Looks good. Looks good. Actually looks pretty nice. And it's subtle, but you can definitely see the difference. Now after that, I can probably go in and add another one for the greens. Now every place you shoot's obviously going to be a little bit different. We definitely have that warm mountain and the green trees to contend with here, so I'm going to go ahead and just use the simple green like this. Close that up, invert the mask. Same thing with the brush here. Let's go ahead and purify some of these greens a little bit. Very painterly. Up here I'm going to be a little bit careful around my edges, but I definitely want to bring some of those greens up. Just like that. That's looking pretty good. Right around here too. Some of this. And, you know, warmth helps a lot because this is a very super green, like green is an RGB kind of green, so it's not a warm tree green. So if you balance that with some of the warming filter, you get a really nice color. That's looking pretty good. So we have the high pass here, we have the warming filters, the shadows. We can add some more contrast overall, but what I want to do is go ahead and duplicate this ACRF file, and we're going to go ahead and call this noise reduction. That's in anticipation of going back up to the filter, camera raw filter. Let's zoom in on this. That looks pretty good. We can actually see everything here. Let's go to the detail panel, noise reduction. Last time it was right around 25 or 30. So as I hit 30, that disappears. The detail is lost. Let's set that to 75 just in case there's some overlap. And let's say OK. Noise reduction layer, I'm going to go ahead and option click this, create a mask. And with the brush tool this time, large brush, 100% flow. Let's go ahead and paint in the sky that we want. So after I do that, what I'm actually going to do is go ahead and enable the Rubylith mode, just so I can see exactly what I'm doing here. Now, again, same technique. I want to get close to that edge as possible with the broad strokes being 100% opacity. And then what I'm going to do is go down to a lower flow and just sort of fade that in. So I want it to fade into the edge. Rather than trying to mask that hard edge, I'm just going to very softly and gently sort of fade that into the surrounding pixels. Here too, if I zoom in and pan here to the right, smaller brush, lighter flow. Now, I was very careful to be very minimal on this noise reduction. So if there's a little bit of overlap, it's okay. In the foreground, you probably want less overlap around the church, heavy details like that. But here, definitely, I want to make sure that I remove it from the water. Just finalize that masking, just like that. Zoom it back out. Disable Rubylith. Back it out one more step so we can take a look. I think that looks really nice. So now it's time to take a look at everything that we did. So if I go ahead and expand this down here, you can see we have quite a few options. We have quite a few steps. We have where we started with the original RAW. Now remember, this original RAW was straight out of camera, not only straight out of camera, it was the metered exposure, white balance was set to auto, cameras and aperture priority. It's basically what the camera thought was perfect, and it was near perfect. It did a really good job. So let's go ahead and isolate it. Let's check it out, the original RAW. And after that, we adjusted it. We added some different things. We removed the car, did some cleanup, added some filters, and we went from this to this. So quite a dramatic before and after, and we were able to take basically a single moment in time and get the most out of the highlights and shadows. And to be honest, when I was shooting the first scene in Positano, that sunset that ended up being a blended moments in time shot, I was kind of thinking that I was going to like that shot the best, but now seeing that one and this one together, I really don't know. I think that I ended up getting two very unique shots, so I really don't have a favorite. I actually like them both. In fact, I may like this one better just because it has this really neat shape, like this cross across the image, the infinite distance of the mountain and the church, and it has that opposing light, so it has warmer values, and it was less work all around. I really feel like if you looked at this shot
and the previous shot, and you showed those to people, they would be convinced that that could be two separate towns. So this is a good way, again, as I talked about in the field, is if you scout enough, you can actually end up with two portfolio shots instead of one for each place that you visit. So this could be a representation of Positano, and so could the last shot. So that wraps it up for this lesson, guys. The next time you see us, we're going to be moving along the coast and taking a visit to my favorite little town called Atrani. Now, this is a really cool little village, and when I say taking a visit, I mean driving, and when I say driving, I mean me driving, because again, Lee was terrified, and Patrick conveniently couldn't drive a stick shift. So we'll see you guys back in the field.